Okay.
So thank you again, Dr. Burbanks, for your time today in discussing your white paper with us and subsequent practitioner brief that we've created. And so I wanted to just kind of start us off with getting a better understanding of your motivation behind writing this concept paper.
My motivation comes out of some research that I did as a doctoral student um, that kind of paralleled with this issue. What I dealt with in my doctoral dissertation was the learning preferences of Black children and how that was affected by culture and genetics. And as I began to look at that, I began to see in the literature that there was a connection between genetics and affective disorders, in that people of African descent and people who come from collectivist cultures have a genetic variant that predisposes them to environmental stress or affective disorders when contacted with environmental stressors. And with that in mind, there's a lot of trauma that Black people in America deal with because there's so many environmental stressors, racism being one of them, that got me involved in wanting to look at trauma inside of African American community and how that is dealt with in terms of the counseling and mental health industries as well as education.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, those are things I've definitely seen, not only in the education space, but in practice and communities as well. And also my personal life.
Right.
And so that leads me to my next question. I know that in the title and throughout the body of the paper, you are essentially writing to both educators and like counselors and community members. So can you speak a little bit about you are kind of wanting to tailor this paper to that specific audience?
Yeah. Well, it's 2021, and there still are a lot of disparities in how mental health issues and the education of Black children specifically are dealt with. And I wanted to reach out to practitioners, teachers, to help them further understand the need for a culturally centered practice and practices, and as well as to community members who may not understand that involving our culture can go a long way in healing some of the issues that we have with our youth mental health, as well as providing better education or having students respond better to education when we add culture to the equation.
Right. Right, absolutely. And I love the pieces in your paper about and it'll be published on our on the Crest website pretty soon. But I specifically love the more concrete suggestions that you had included because I see those as really beneficial for folks like, okay, include culture, like where do we go? And you talk about like using, I think you use a different terminology, but like using their slang,
Right.
honoring like, you know, different ways of upbringing and how that can enter the classroom. So I really appreciated that piece as well. Um, so that leads me to my next question. So in wanting to encourage the infusion of culture into education and clinical practice, what does that look like for folks who may not be insiders of our culture? How
Mm.
do our white educators and counselors and community members go about infusing or honoring Black culture when working with Black youth?
Mm-hmm. Well, I come from an education background, so I may talk a little bit more about education than counseling or mental health. But what it looks like in education is some of the things that I mentioned inside of the paper, uh, in terms of understanding where the youth come from and environment, understanding their environment, understanding some of the cultural reference in terms of African culture, for instance, collectivism. A lot of students come out of a culture that is very interdependent versus the European culture, which is individualistic, and that's what the value is. And European culture is to value the individual, value individual rights, value autonomy, whereas from an African perspective, it is uh, the value is placed on interdependence, on collectivism, on valuing the group over the individual, which doesn't negate an individual's own unique expression of themselves, but there's a greater value placed on collectivism. So in the classroom, it might look like um, having students work together on a project versus having them do something individually and say you do your own work, you find your own answer,
Right.
um, versus working collectively in groups so that everybody has a chance to participate, everybody can have an opportunity to help each other along the way. So that's one way of using African cultural aspects inside the classroom. Another one I talked about was, as you said, using the language that the youth use, or I try to understand it. You know, I don't understand everything, but I try to listen and I have them teach me what certain things mean, especially in the classroom. If I hear something, a word that I don't know and understand, um, I'll ask them what it means so that, you know, I'm familiar with the language that they're using. And that kind of endears you to the students to have them um, or when you recognize them and recognize their language, you don't dismiss it and you're not dismissive of it. They tend to be more endeared to you than those who say, you know, why don't you speak English right? Or, you know, speak correct English and things like that. So just understanding where they come from, understanding their cultural values, understanding your own, especially if you're coming from a Eurocentric perspective and how that might come in conflict with what they bring from the community and from the home, and valuing that in the classroom.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think about even my own experience way back when in grade school and how a lot of these things, were shunned,
Mm-hmm.
working in groups, speaking in African American vernacular English, all those things where, we were taught you can't do those things. Our style of dress, I know you wrote about that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really awesome to see a professional be speaking up and advocating for infusing culture into the classroom and into our educational and community spaces. So my next question is really just based on the fact that, everything we've discussed so far, like sounds really great. And, folks might be listening and thinking like, I'm on board with that. But
Mm-hmm.
how do I go about doing that or infusing those things within a system that maybe isn't so welcoming of that? So if there's a teacher listening or a counselor that wants to incorporate these things, but their school or their school system or the agency that they work for isn't supportive of that.
Mm-hmm. That I don't want to say it's a hard question, but I've come up against that in my own experience in public schools, and part of you has to be courageous in order to do those things. And I always I always tell teachers, you know, if you want to bring culture into the classroom and respect the culture of students in order to reach them better, you have to be prepared to leave sometimes. You know, it might not be a right fit for you, or because you don't want to bump heads all the time. So I always tell them, you know, be prepared to leave. You know, uh, but it can be difficult to try to bring culture into the classroom, especially if the administration is not on board. But if you are not in a position to uh, not leave, or you don't have that courage to do it, do the little things that are possible. For instance, as I spoke about the language. Try understanding where the children are coming from. Try understanding where your clients are coming from. Allow them some agency in what they're doing. So these are some little things that are not, I don't think upset the administration when you do that. Allow them to sort of chart the direction of the class. I always ask when I make rules in the classroom, I ask the students to help me with those rules, help, and that gives them some agency, and it also helps me to reinforce them because I can say, hey, I didn't come up with these by myself. We all came up with them. It was a collective effort. So you can do little things like that that bring some of the culture in if you're not really ready to go to war with the administration over things like that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that example. Maybe it's how my brain works, but I often find the concrete examples really beneficial in reading about this type of thing. So what I'm gathering is that it's really a collaborative, kind of almost like an egalitarian type approach where we're
Right.
not just imposing our own values and the values of our profession onto the students.
Yeah. Again, when you look at people who come from collectivist orientations, specifically African people, there's a brother named Dr. Edwin Nichols, and he developed this chart called the philosophical aspects of cultural, I forget the name, but he came up with this chart, and it basically describes the philosophical aspects of cultural differences among races. And for African people, he says that the highest value is the relationship between individuals or between groups. So understanding that the highest value for people of African descent is relationships, then that's where you should start, is building strong relationships with your clients, building strong relationship with students, and that will that'll almost take care of half the resistance you might have in teaching or in counseling, is when you develop a relationship with the client or with the students.
Absolutely. Yeah. In the counseling world, we call that like our therapeutic alliance.
Okay, yeah.
And they teach us to build that first before, doing any sort of confrontation or any sort of challenging. Like they say, you can't do that until you build your therapeutic alliance and your rapport. So definitely see some overlap between the professions there. So something that's been difficult for me to ignore is this pandemic and thinking about
Right.
education in a virtual space. So I'm wondering like what you think this entire concept paper could look like within, school districts that might be primarily or solely virtual right now. How can educators and clinicians be infusing culture into Zoom?
Right, and that's difficult. There are articles coming out now, not um, academic articles, but news articles talking about students and how some of the students are very distressed because of the distance learning, because they aren't able to have the interaction with their friends and with teachers, and how that is posing an issue for students. I work with a program called Upward Bound at the University of Cincinnati. And one of the things that we did, because we had to become virtual, is that we held our meetings, or some of the meetings, and we had all the students in the meeting. So if we had 20 students, it would be 20 students inside the meeting. And one of the things that we always did was like a check-in to see how students were doing, and allow students to connect with each other. And as we connected with them as well, it wasn't a face-to-face in-person connection, but I still think it helped because they got to see each other and talk to each other online, and which they hadn't been able to do for a while because we hadn't been meeting. So that's one thing that seemed to be real helpful for them, was to allow them some space to connect with each other online before we got down to whatever business we had to do with the program.
Right.
Um, so that's one thing I would suggest, is allowing them some time to connect with each other before um, going deep into the lesson. I know my nephew was doing distance learning
Mhm.
here at my home, and that opportunity was never available. The teacher came on, it was time to work. They didn't. There was no sense of collaboration or talking with each other, and so it was like, get on, let's do the work, let's finish, let's move on to the next thing, and to the end of the day. So, like I said, there was just zero interaction with the students, and that's one thing we did in Upward Bound that I think uh, helped them. And also, like I said, listening to um, some of the issues that they've experienced as a result of COVID.
Mhm.
Some of our students had COVID.
Mhm.
We had students who had family members pass away, so they were allowed to talk about all of that in this space.
Right, right. It seemed, yeah, there's like a continuation of, what we're talking about in the physical face-to-face space versus the virtual space. There's like this continued effort to really put the ball in students' courts and for them to lead with their language, lead with their culture, and of course, get their work done, but
Yes.
do so in a way that feels consistent or congruent with who they are.
Hmm.
So okay. So very last question. I'm wondering, I know that we've got your entire paper that will be posted. We've
Hmm.
also got this brief fact sheet for folks to review. If there is one takeaway that folks can get from your paper, what would you want that to be?
The centrality of culture and how that impacts the interactions between students and teachers, as well as clients and clinicians, how that cannot be ignored. The cultural perspective that people are coming from, and your own cultural perspective that you bring into the counseling or teaching space. Um, that's just one of the most, for me, one of the most important things is to try not to separate people from that, because I don't think you can deal with the whole person when that happens. In our professions, there's this thing to try to be objective and to you know separate things into all these little parts. But people don't come in little parts. They bring all these things together with them, and the biggest thing I think they bring is culture. So understanding the culture that they come from, and it requires some work. You can't just try to understand it on an individual basis. You got to go out and read the research. You got to go out. You have to learn the different cultural realities that people experience, whether you're African American, Native American, Latino, whatever. You got to go out and do the work. So that when people from these different cultural groups come in, you can deal with them on a better a basis than just bringing that Eurocentric uh, um, um, uh, educational background to the table. Because, as far as I know, in my experience, they do not provide that kind of education inside of teacher ed programs. They might have one or two classes that talk about culture and race, but there's no curriculum that deals with it to let them know that these are the things you kind of need to know before you go into the profession, so that you can connect with your students, connect with your patients, and have better outcomes as a result. So culture for me is one of the primary things that we have to that I want folks to understand, and how that affects how we interact with folks, and how folks can interact with us as we try to become educated and become healthy mentally. So culture is the primary thing for me.
Yes, yes. It's almost like if culture is not accounted for, attended to,
Hmm.
infused thoroughly, then there's like a wall up between
Right.
student and teacher, between counselor and client, or that sort of thing. So culture,
Exactly.
culture. Yeah.
Yeah, and generally it is that way. A lot of times there's a wall up, and if you don't have the key, which is understanding the culture, you they won't let you in, or if they let you in, it's not it's halfway. They have the door cracked, and you're communicating through a cracked door. So understanding culture, I believe, gives you the key to come in, and that has worked very well for me in terms of education and dealing with students, understanding, I come from the culture, but there still are things that, um, as I said, youth can teach me. When I used to teach in public schools, I did have a different attitude once, and that was, I'm the teacher, you're the student, I'm here to teach, you here to learn, and there wasn't a lot I was expected of myself to learn from them. And that changed as, I matured in the profession. And so now it's a whole different way of approaching students. I want to learn from them, and I expect them to learn from me. And so it's an exchange between the two of us.
Right.
Um, so
Absolutely. That's a beautiful thing. Well, I'm really thankful again for your time today. And so I
problem.
appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about your paper, which is going to be posted on our CREST website and the fact sheet as well. So we hope to have some interaction with you in the
Oh
future.
man, yeah, I can't wait.
Yes, absolutely. Alrighty.